Hey guys, it's Amber. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have a video full of podcast recommendations for you. So I've done a few blog posts in the past where I talk about the podcasts that I love or that I'm listening to at the moment, and I will link all of those down in the description box. So if it's not on this list, it's probably on one of those. I listen to a ton of podcasts. First thing I do in the morning typically is put on a podcast and listen to it while I get ready or respond to emails or even do blog post edits. It's like really a part of my everyday routine. I listen to them when I walk to work, while I'm at work. It's just a nice break from the monotony of your day-to-day. So without further ado, let's get on to the podcast. So the first podcast that I'm going to recommend to you guys is Still Processing, which is hosted by Jenna Wortham and Wesley Morris. Those two kind of unpack different identity and political topics that I think are all super interesting. My favorite episode has probably been the one that was entitled, I think, Modern Day Blackface, where they look at a cartoon that's really popular and I think the Dominican Republic, where the main character is literally in blackface, and it's one of the more popular cartoon or animated shows over there. Actually, I don't think it's animated. There's an actor who literally plays a character in blackface. They do a great job at presenting the issue in a really digestible and easy to process, still processing way. They talk about really relevant things, whether it's like Kanye's spiral or President Trump's latest Twitter tirade or whatever. And they really do bring you the facts. They also bring in interesting people to offer new perspectives into the conversation. So I highly recommend you give them a listen. They also did a full episode unpacking Beachella. Beyonce. Listen to the podcast. The next podcast I want to recommend to you guys is the Code Switch podcast, which is hosted by several journalists of color from NPR. Code Switch focuses on topics of race and identity politics and really tries to unpack modern day news titles and issues that would be important to us in a way that really kind of pulls out the issue that we may be uncomfortable to talk about, especially if you're not a person of color. So if you're the kind of person who's found yourself really thinking on these topics but not knowing where to start when it comes to having an actual productive conversation, I recommend that you give this podcast a listen. The third podcast I'm going to recommend to you guys is one of my all-time favorites, and it's a part of a larger network, so you can honestly listen to any podcast on this network and you will not miss. And that is Pod Save America, which is hosted by Jon Lovett, Tommy Vitor. Pod Save America is hosted by Jon Favreau, Jon Lovett, Dan Pfeiffer, and Tommy Vitor, who were all former aides in the Obama administration. They all worked in the administration in some way, shape, or form, either as a speechwriter or as a part of the actual administration staff. And their insights are incredible. They're also probably the funniest guys in podcasting. They take literally the headlines of the hour and they dissect them. They bring on guests. They've spoken with everyone from former President Obama to Hillary Clinton to former presidents Jimmy Carter, like literally anyone has been on their podcast. They talk to Democratic candidates who are going to be running, so it's really interesting and a great way to keep up to date with the news without feeling kind of like overwhelmed by the news. I think when you just read the headlines or you're just scrolling Twitter, it's easy to just be inundated without having that friendly, easy to digest friend who's helping you unpack it, and that's what John, Tommy, and Dan do. Fourth podcast I want to mention to you guys is called Second Life by My Domain, where they speak with different women who have had kind of like one leg of their career followed by a change or a different shift in direction in their career, and they kind of talk about how they got to where they are. So obviously my favorite episode was the Lauren Conrad episode, but there are so many great insights about women who have built amazing businesses and brands and careers and lives for themselves that you can really learn from. I think they do a great job of asking not just the basic, how did you get to where you are questions, but also about the obstacles and the real life journey people took. Like, I think that so often we read these articles and it's like, oh, of course, X woman built a multi-million-dollar brand, but half of those multi-million she borrowed from her parents. And it's nice to actually see an authentic representation of what someone's journey looked like, regardless of how they got to where they are. Similar to Second Life, the fifth podcast I want to mention is called Lip Stories, which is in partnership with Girl Boss Radio and Sephora, which is an interesting combination. But basically, they tell stories of women who work in media, digital, fashion style, the online space predominantly. My favorite episode was the one they did with Aminatou Sow, who is the host of the Call Your Girlfriend podcast, or co-host of the Call Your Girlfriend podcast. Also a really great show. These women talk about everything from travel to finances to business to style and fashion and ritual and routine. So if you really like just getting into the heads of other people and really making those friends in your head, I recommend this podcast. For the book lovers who watch these videos, which I think are a lot of you, I recommend the Bad on Paper podcast hosted by Grace Atwood and Becca Freeman. I mentioned them in a favorites video a few months back, but I really love this podcast. Basically, they do alternating episodes. So one week they'll focus on a book review where they'll kind of take a book that they tell you in advance so you can read it with them, and they'll review it, unpack it, talk about their thoughts and feelings. And the next episode is an advice themed episode where they have listeners send in different topics of concern and they answer your questions on air, from anything from living in New York City to travel to money to how to read more to reading bad books and the stigma around adults who read YA. So they're really funny. They're kind of like my friends in my head. I've read Grace's blog for the longest time, and it's great to get to connect with her in a new medium. So I definitely recommend checking those out for some great book recommendations. And for the bookish people out there, I'm recommending the What Should I Read Next podcast, hosted by Anne Vogel. She's also run an amazing blog called The Modern Mrs. Darcy, where she's been recommending books, I feel like, for years and years and years. She's also written 2 books, I think, at this point, which I will also link down below. I haven't read them yet, but they're definitely on my list. On her podcast, What Should I Read Next, she brings on a guest and they talk about books that they've loved, books that they hate, and then Anne recommends them a series of new books that she thinks that they will love, what they should read next. I feel like I'm always like listening while I'm getting ready in the morning and then stopping to like write down book titles or authors that I haven't heard of. It's a great way to discover new reads or new authors. So if you are in the market for what you should read next, check out this podcast. I have 2 more podcasts that I want to recommend to you guys. The first one is one of my favorites. I never miss an episode, and that is The Read, hosted by Crystal and Kid Fury. It is the funniest podcast that you will listen to by far. It's hosted on the Loudspeakers Network, and they drop episodes every Thursday. I usually listen on Friday morning. It's a great way to start your weekend. They comment on everything from pop culture to taking listener letters where crazy, wild things happen. The listener letters are just out of control, honestly, but they're so wonderful. I've seen them live. I've traveled to see them. Like, they are spectacular hosts. Kid Fury and Crystal are insightful, funny, smart, incredibly talented. So I highly recommend you subscribe and listen to The Read. And the last podcast that I'll be recommending today is Small Doses by Amanda Seale. I also mentioned this podcast in a recent favorites video. In Small Doses, Amanda takes one topic, which she calls a side effect, and then unpacks that and kind of gives you a little dose of therapy. My favorite episode is called Side Effects of Being an Independent Woman, where Amanda kind of takes basically toxic masculinity and kind of breaks that down and reminds you that you don't have to feel bad about knowing how to build your own furniture and not needing a man to do that for you. And as a man, you shouldn't feel any less validated when a woman can do those things. Alright guys, that's it for my podcast recommendations for today. Comment down below what your favorite podcast is at the moment, what you've been listening to, anything like that. I'm always looking for more podcast recommendations, even though I clearly have plenty to listen to. But I love to hear what you guys are listening to as well. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this channel and thumbs up this video if you liked it. Share it with a friend. I'd appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!